Good morning, everyone. The Mountain Plains Prevention Technology Transfer Center at the University of Utah is excited to welcome you to our six-part webinar series, Informing Prevention with an emphasis on adolescence. Before we introduce our presenter, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping slides with you. A recording of this webinar, as well as a PDF of the PowerPoint slides, will be posted on our website at pttcnetwork.org/mountainplains. For those of you interested in a certificate following today's webinar, please email mountainplains_pttc@utah.edu. NAEDAC approval is pending, and for all other licensure and credentials, please apply directly to your board. We encourage you to use the chat feature for questions and messages today. Following the webinar, you will see a link in the chat feature, as well as a QR code to complete a survey. The survey is required for all training and events funded by SAMHSA. They want to know how well we provide our services, and we want your feedback to help us continue to improve our trainings. We ask that you take a few minutes to complete the GIPR survey at the end of this webinar. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Dr. Jason Burrow-Sanchez is a professor of counseling psychology in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Utah. He is also the director of the Mountain Plains Region 8 Prevention Technology Transfer Center, funded by SAMHSA. His research interests include prevention and treatment of substance use for adolescents in school and community settings. His research has been funded at the local, state, and national levels, and he has published numerous articles, chapters, and books. He is also a licensed psychologist in the state of Utah. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Rory, and thanks everybody for spending some time with us today. I appreciate the introduction. So if you've sat in my webinars before, you know that I like to kind of conceptualize them around some key questions or things that we're going to try to answer throughout the next hour. And so one of the things I wanted to say is I appreciate you being with me, whether it be a late morning or early afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're in. So welcome. And the three key questions that we're going to focus on today for today's webinar are the following. So the first one is, what are the rates of adolescent engagement and intervention programs? And first, I just want to give you a pre-warning to that, is that the data on rates of engagement in adolescent prevention programs don't exist like they do for treatment programs. So we don't know as much about prevention programs as we do in relation to treatment programs, and I'll show you that in a sec, in terms of what does retention and engagement look like. So that's one of the things I think nationally we need to work on more to have an understanding of that. But also we're going to be talking about at what point along the continuum does the preventive intervention take place, or does the intervention take place? And what I did here in this first question is I actually broadened it to call it an intervention as opposed to just a prevention program, because there is a continuum of interventions, and I'll explain that in a sec. The second question we'll talk about is what prevents adolescents from engaging in intervention programs? And no pun intended, I know this is a prevention-based webinar, but what are the reasons why we have a more difficulty engaging adolescents in prevention programs for one reason or another? And we'll look at some of those issues, and myself included. I tend to think of those things initially as being more individual focused, but I'm going to encourage you to think more broadly and think more systems based and so forth as we go through. Another piece that I want to talk about, or another question that we have, are what ways can we increase engagement in adolescent intervention programs? You know, and in particular this, what I'm going to be talking about a bit is kind of the micro level, the behavior level, and also more the macro level, and I'll explain that as we go through it, of interventions that we use. So what is the interaction between the types of interventions we're trying to implement in relation to the individuals we're trying to implement them with? So what does that look like? Okay, so the goal here today is to get through these three questions and talk about them. Before we kind of jump into those or dive into those, I did want to point out some different prevention frameworks. And the reason is because some of you may be familiar with some of these, and one of the prevention frameworks that you may be familiar with is SAMHSA's Strategic Prevention Framework, which is more of a kind of a process or a planning model. And it includes a number of different components, as you can see by the diagram on the right side of the screen. We're going to be spending probably a little more time today talking about more of the planning and implementation aspects and a little bit of evaluation in terms of these components. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this framework, but just to point that out. Another framework that you may be familiar with is the Institute of Medicine Continuum of Care framework. And for us today, we're going to spend a bit more time talking about this side of it, or the prevention side of it, which is also termed into three different areas: universal, selective, and indicated. And then the continuum kind of goes from left to right, so that also delves into treatment and then maintenance and so forth. But we're going to be more focused on these areas. And then a third model that you may be familiar with, especially if you work in school-based settings, is the triangle, or what I like to call the prevention triangle. And these models, the three that I just showed you, are complementary to each other. And I like to think about the prevention triangle in part because it helps me conceptualize how to think about how we implement programs, how to think about how we implement programs with individuals and within particular settings. So what I'm going to ask you to do for our presentation today is think about this triangle as perhaps one school or one setting, but for me, it helps to think about it as one school. And if we think about it from a prevention perspective, primary prevention or universal prevention, or another way we talk about it is tier 1 prevention, is everybody gets the intervention. Okay, so if you're in a school, it may be that everyone is exposed to school-wide rules for different things to maybe increase positive behaviors, decrease negative behaviors, whatever those behaviors may be, and so forth. And if you're also in a school, a secondary prevention or a selective or a tier 2 intervention would be those interventions that are usually small group-based interventions that are targeted for kids who are at risk for the particular behaviors that you're looking at. So this may be substance use, this may be externalizing behavior, this may be acting out, whatever that may be, but it's more of a selective-based intervention. And then tier 3, if you're working in a school, sometimes tier 3 interventions are not available in schools. And so sometimes tier 3 interventions look more like treatment, because this is maybe perhaps when the youth gets referred out to intervention, so maybe substance use treatment and so forth. It just really depends on the context and the setting that you're in terms of what the school district has access to and so forth. But I like this model because it kind of simply puts that it translates what universal, selective, and indicated, or primary, secondary, or tertiary prevention look like. And the other thing it does is visually displays this, but it also gives you an idea of how many youth respond to these types of interventions. So if you look at the green part of the triangle, that represents about 80% of youth in a school. The yellow part of the triangle represents about 15%, and the top part of the triangle represents about 5%. So the idea is with universal prevention, we're probably going to, it's probably about 80% of the youth are going to respond to it, even though we give it to 100% of the youth, which means there's going to be about 15% more youth who are going to have higher needs, and about even 5% higher needs than that. And so our interventions kind of have to change depending on the level of prevention we're working at and the needs of the youth. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that as we go up the triangle, it becomes more difficult to engage youth, okay? So if we're doing a universal-based prevention where we have everybody in a classroom, let's say everybody gets a curriculum and a health, or everybody gets an intervention as part of the health curriculum or health course in a school, then we have everybody. As we start to select kids out, right, or youth out for interventions, it becomes more difficult to engage them for various reasons. We know this from different literature bases. As the behaviors become more severe, whether it be substance use or acting out behavior, it just in general, it's more difficult to engage youth. Okay, so just to put that in mind, let's talk about more specifically what we mean by engagement and retention. So a couple of things I want to point out is engagement and retention are interesting concepts. And one thing that I definitely know by reviewing the literature is they're not defined consistently across the literature. So depending on what you're talking about, right? One person could be talking about engagement and one person could be talking about retention, but they could be talking about different concepts. So for example, let's take one of these and make more sense out of it. So engagement, what I mean here is really for you in terms of if you're implementing interventions and working with youth, one of the things that's really important is to define what engagement looks like. What does it mean for your intervention? So for interventions we've done both in schools and community settings, we define engagement by practice sheet return, which are practice sheets that we give to the youth that we work with. they turn those back. We actually track that. So I've graphed that here. This is just made up data, but you can see the number of sheets returned or the number of practice sheets returned based on the number of sessions. So in this graph, we have 8 sessions in this intervention. We can see that, session number 3, 6 youth returned their practice sheets. Session number 8, or I'm sorry, session number 5, 8 youth returned their practice sheets. So we can kind of see the rates of return. And what this gives us is an indicator of how much youth are engaging in our practice sheet, in part because we know that returning practice sheets from kind of cognitive behaviorally based intervention is actually a good indicator that the intervention is going to have more effect. So that's one of the things we know that. What I'm trying to show you, though, is that you don't have to define engagement like this. You can define it as how many times does the youth participate during the session, right? How many times do they answer questions, or do they raise their hands, or whatever it may be. The most important thing is you define it in a way that makes sense for your intervention, so that you're measuring something that you want to know about. Okay, and the reason I point that out is because in the literature, engagement has different definitions depending on who's measuring it. The other thing is, in relation to engagement, the other thing we talk about is retention. Similar concept in terms of there's inconsistency across the literature in terms of how it's measured. In our interventions, we tend to measure retention as attendance. How many times does the youth attend? And we can graph it just like we did here. I didn't graph it for you in this slide, or this half of the slide. But how many times, what's the attendance rates look like, right? How many times does a youth attend? If we have 8 sessions, what's the attendance rate? Is it 75%? Is it 50%? Is it 40%? What does that look like? And again, the big concept here is just to say, or the big take-home message rather, is just to say, regardless of what retention is per se, you need to define it for your setting and what it's like for your setting so that it's meaningful for your setting. And for us in our studies, what we tend to find is retention is best defined for us as attendance. Okay, so big take-home message for this slide is you need to define retention and engagement. So the other thing I mentioned is I mentioned in the first question, what are rates of retention and engagement in terms of preventive interventions? Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data on that. We don't have a lot of data on that nationally. So what we have to look to is some of the other data that we have in terms of treatment data. And so if you think back to our triangle, treatment data probably happens more at the top of the triangle. So those are youth that are, if you're working in a school setting where they're being referred out, if the school doesn't have tertiary level intervention. And so what we can look at from a national level is treatment completion data. It just gives us some indication of how well youth are being retained in intervention settings. So I do work with treatment providers a lot, as well as prevention providers. These are data taken from the treatment episode data set. And this is 2005 data, but it doesn't change that much, to be honest. These are from ages 12 to 17. This is from SAMHSA. This is publicly available data. You can access it yourself. I did, and then I just graphed it. And what I did here is I graphed data because I was really interested to learn how many youth, when they're involved in a treatment, when they're involved in or substance use treatment, how many youth actually complete that treatment on a national level. So this is national data. The data on this slide represent about 60,000 youth in 2015 between the ages of 12 to 17. So I realized that the dark colored bars, your eyes are kind of naturally drawn to, and I did this on purpose. And actually the dark colored bars, as what you can see here at the bottom, are youth who didn't complete treatment. So if we actually look at those percentages, what we know from treatment data is that on average, we have more youth who don't complete treatment than do. Okay, so as we move up the triangle, as I was saying before, it's harder to engage youth in the interventions. So if we just kind of look at these, and there's some disparities here too, which I'm not going to get into today, but there's plenty of studies on that as well. But I think the big take-home message here is that on average, when everything else is equal, by and large, youth are less likely to complete treatment or complete intervention than they are to complete it. Okay. Okay, let me move on to the next slide. So the next question, I just wanted to kind of transition to our second question is really the idea of why don't adolescents attend or participate in our interventions, okay? And as I said before, when we think about the triangle, as we move up the triangle, it's more difficult, and for whatever reasons. So here's some of the common reasons that I typically hear. Is it due to the motivation of the adolescent? They're just not motivated to engage in my intervention. I have the greatest intervention ever. I know a lot about interventions, right? I'm saying this a bit sarcastically. And they just don't want to engage in it for whatever reason. They don't want to come, they don't want to engage. Is it due to their specific characteristics, right? Is it due to the participants that we work with? Are they just too hard to reach? The youth, the parents, the families, and one concept that I'm gonna ask you to think about is our direct and our indirect consumers of our interventions. So our direct consumers of our interventions are folks who actually engage in our interventions. It could be the youth, the adolescent. Indirect consumers of interventions are folks like parents and families, right? And the school and teachers and other folks who are involved in the intervention in some capacity, but maybe not directly, but folks that we also want to think about, how do we engage? Is it due to psychological factors or socioeconomic factors? And the reality is it could be due to any of those things. And the reason I point these things out on this slide is because these are some of the things I commonly hear. And however, what I want to do is also have you think about what are some of the ways, more broadly speaking, what are some of the ways we implement programs? So this is a program implementation continuum. And typically the ways we implement programs, many times what I've seen, is we go to a list and we say, well, what are the best programs? You know, what are the programs out there? Or people ask me, so what program should I use? And so on and so forth, right? And there's different lists that are out there that says this program's great or whatever. And it may be, right, based on the research and all that. So one way we do that is we just implement an evidence-based program, which could be great, right? The upside of that is the evidence-based program sounds good, it's on a list, usually, and you know, we may have to do that because of the way we're funded and so on and so forth. The downside of that is if we just implement that program the way it is, it may not always engage all the adolescents that we're trying to engage. Why is that? Well, one reason why is because the evidence-based program wasn't maybe tested with the adolescents that we're working with, right? The particular populations that we're working with, or the settings that we're working in and so forth. Okay, so just one way, just a way to think about it. Another way on the other side of the continuum is we implement programs based on what are the community needs, right? We don't necessarily think about what's on the list or what's the evidence-based programs on the list, but what's the community needs. The upside of this is it may be really targeted towards the community, and it may help us with recruitment and retention from the very beginning. But some of the outcomes we may be less sure about, okay? But the reality is most of the time we're probably doing something in the middle. We're probably somehow adapting an evidence-based program to fit the needs of our setting and with the adolescents or the youth or the consumers, or specifically that we're working with. Okay, so really the take-home message from this slide is I really want you to think about, consider which of these implementation strategies are we doing from the beginning before you even implement the program. Why? Because all influences for how the program gets implemented. So let's kind of take that in line with thinking about it another way in terms of how we typically think about how we implement programs or why adolescents do or don't engage in our programs, right? So one is the program implementation phase. The other one is, well, we have a program, we're implementing it with adolescents. They should engage in our program. Why? Because maybe we have the assumption that it's the best program ever and so on and so forth, and it very well may be. But what I want you to think about, and what I talked about before, some of the micro and macro levels, if we just stay stuck on thinking about the adolescents we're working with, I kind of call that a micro level, thinking about just the adolescent behavior and just the adolescents attending our program. Well, what about the other levels that we want to engage in too? We know from the developmental literature that family, school, and peers are the three most socializing agents that adolescents have. I would consider these sources to be indirect consumers of our intervention, where the adolescent, let's say we have a school-based program and the adolescents engaged in the program, or we recruit adolescents to be in our program, which are direct consumers of our intervention. These are indirect consumers of our intervention. So why, even if we have an adolescent-based program, why wouldn't we want to do something to engage the family? Or perhaps to engage the peers, or perhaps to engage the school. Because we know from the literature that anytime we make these areas more positive for the adolescent, it tends to produce better outcomes. Well, I also want to broaden this as well. Is there anything we can do to engage the community or engage the neighborhood? Or what about the societal norms and laws or geographic differences that we're dealing with at a particular moment? So let me give you an example. For example, if you're working with a group of Latino adolescents, like I've done a lot of, how, right now in our current climate, what are some of the societal norms and laws that and geographic differences may be on the minds of Latino adolescents as you're working with them? And if you're just implementing an evidence-based intervention that doesn't take any of that into account, do you think that's going to influence retention and engagement? My guess is it probably will. So that's why I'm suggesting here's your direct consumers of your intervention. Here's some of your indirect consumers of your intervention. Okay. So more specifically, I'm going to have you think about it this way. So the The third question that we're going to focus on is how do we go about increasing engagement and retention for adolescents in our intervention programs? Well, in order to do that, I want you to think about it from this framework. Okay, so like I said before, typically in my training included, we kind of get stuck sometimes in thinking about the micro levels, like targeting specific behaviors. And that's generally related to the person or adolescent we're working with, right? They're not attending, so what am I going to do to increase their attendance? They're not returning their practice sheets. They're not engaging during the session, so what am I going to do to change that? Well, the other thing that I really want you to think about during this webinar is also the macro levels, or the targeting the program behavior. What about all the other things in the environment? These may be the indirect consumers that we don't necessarily always consider in the environment. How do we engage that? What does our program look like, and so forth? Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time in the next couple slides just talking about some of the micro behaviors. And we're usually pretty good at this. And micro behavior is specifically targeting, for lack of a better way to say it, specific behavior. This also may be things that you've heard about in terms of contingency management or motivational incentives. These are all similar concepts. It comes out of the behaviorism literature, which has been around for decades, okay? It's not new. Contingency management within the last decade or so is a newer way to think about it in terms, or reformulated, repackaged way to think about it in terms of the substance use literature. But again, all these principles have been around for a long time, and things that we've learned usually in our training programs as well. So basically principles, based on principles of learning and models of behavior, your old antecedent behavior and consequences. It's ways to make changes in behavior really at a micro level. And typically the target is a specific behavior to change. So we want to change a specific behavior and then provide reinforcers for doing so. So let me make this more clear, more concrete, giving an example. One example is the Fishbowl method. So if, let's say, we just want to increase, we want to focus on a micro behavior for the adolescent, and we're really concerned about increasing attendance. So adolescent walks into the door during our sessions. Every session they walk in, they pick out a slip out of the fishbowl. On that slip, there may be a particular reinforcer like good job or thanks for attending today. There may be a more tangible reinforcer, like maybe they get a candy bar or something else to eat, or some type of other prize that makes sense for them, right? Or maybe they collect the slips over time, and then they can turn it in for some reinforcer that's reinforcing to them, more like a token economy and so forth. We could also use this in the context of our interventions if we want to increase engagement or increase participation in the intervention. So every time an adolescent raises their hand, they can pick up a slip out of the fishbowl, and again, there may be a reinforcer. There will be a reinforcer attached to that. It can be anything from praise, good job, nice interacting, to something that's more tangible. And these are methods, right? This is one example of a method that's been used a lot, and you can absolutely use it. It can absolutely be effective, but it's based more on the micro level as opposed to the macro level. And it's one way you can think about it. But what I'm trying to say here is this is typically where we get stuck, and we don't go beyond thinking about how do we really consider these concepts, and how do we engage adolescents also, not only from the micro level, but also from the macro level. So let's talk about that a second. And one term that I want to introduce to you today, and you may already have heard about it, is the idea around social validity. And social validity is a term that helps me kind of define or think about targeting program behavior. So what is social validity? So the way I kind of define social validity, and we've used it in my work, is that social validity really increases the attractiveness of the program for participants. And one of the ways we can engage participants from the beginning, right before they even walk in the door, so to speak, is to have a program that's attractive for them. And what I talked about is if you just pick a program off a list, which you can do, and it could be effective, is that program naturally always going to be attractive for the participants that you're trying to engage? Well, it may or may not, but that's something you want to consider from your implementation, to think about how is this program going to serve the participants that I'm working with. So let me give you a more specific example. So I put a Sunday on this slide here. And the reason I put a Sunday is because I had an idea, or I made an assumption, that most of you viewing the webinar today would think that the Sunday is something good, something that you like, something that you want to engage in. So I have three girls, 3 daughters, and they would all say, I know if I asked them, they would all say, yeah, Dad, this is something I want. This is something I want to engage in, right? This is attractive to me. So the reason that I put it on there is because I know that this Sunday, the picture of the Sunday, would increase the social validity of this slide for you. Right? It would make it more attractive to you. You'd be more likely to kind of think about and be attentive to what I have to say, because I'm introducing something that you already like. And so when I talk about social attractiveness, the idea is, what are the things that are relevant to the adolescents we work with in the program? Now, the flip side of that is, I know because I've done this in presentations before, is there going to be a number of you out there that are going to say, you know, I don't really like sundaes, or I'm lactose intolerant, so I can't eat ice cream, or I don't really like the cherry on top or the whipped cream or whatever that may be, and you may not like that. So the social validity aspect of that, what that's indicating to me is that there's going to be some of you where this intervention, right, this slide is not going to be attractive. So if we take that from an intervention perspective, and we think about, well, there's going to be a certain percentage of youth where interventions are naturally going to be attractive for because of the way the intervention is structured, the things that we're working on and so forth, but there's a certain percentage of youth that they're not going to be attractive for. Well, it's part of what our job is, what I like to say, is to determine how that is and what that looks like for youth. Not to make assumptions that just because we pick out an intervention off a list of interventions that are evidence-based, that it's naturally going to be attractive for every youth that comes into contact with it. And I'm going to guess that it's not. If we just look at the retention rates, what I showed you before, a few slides before, less than half of the youth less than half of our youth are going to complete treatment. So I'm guessing that many of our interventions are not as attractive as we think they are, as the assumptions we make that they are for them. Okay, so if it's us, quote, just the adults, making all the decisions about what things we're going to implement and what things we're going to give to youth, right, have youth intervene with, and if we don't ever ask them about what things are attractive to them, then we're missing a large component of that retention engagement component. So what are some specific ideas around social attractiveness? One's program relevance. Is the program you're trying to implement or you're implementing, and if you're implementing a program right now, think about it. Is the program relevant for the youth that you're implementing with? What are the behaviors you're trying to target? Are the behaviors that are relevant for the youth you're working with? Are they relevant for your setting? Another one I like to talk about is program benefits. Does the program benefit the youth, and does the youth know what those benefits are? So specifically, does your program have a rationale that makes sense to youth? So one of the rules that we have after the first session, we work with youth and in multiple session interventions, after the first session, when the youth walks away from the first session, one of our rules is they need to know what the benefits are of the program for them. If they don't know that, then I haven't done my job as an interventionist. At least I put that on myself, that I need to make sure that they know what the benefits are. So we're going to work on these behaviors, we're going to increase these skill sets, whatever it may be, so on and so forth. But I need to make sure within that first session that I connect with them and make sure that there's some connection around whatever it is, whatever we're going to teach or we're going to learn that has rationale and a benefit for them. Also, your program staff. You know, think about the people who are delivering the intervention. Are they making it a positive intervention? Are they making it something that the youth would want to engage in? Do the youth relate to the staff? Are the staff thinking about things more broadly in terms of social attractiveness of the intervention, the social validity of the intervention, and so forth? And then some really concrete things like logistics. What about the time, location, and cost of the interventions? You know, and you can change these things. When I worked in treatment settings, and I worked with a lot of families who do not come from high income backgrounds, and I know that time is really important, location is really important, right? So am I going to offer it in the middle of the day? Well, I'm probably not. If the families I'm working with don't have things like time off or reliable transportation, I'm probably going to tailor my interventions around times that they can actually make it. And the other thing is cost. Cost meaning, and not only financial cost, but what are the costs to participating in an intervention? And you want to consider that. Is it a time cost? Is it a work demand cost? And so on and so forth. Because those are the ways you can think about what's the social attractiveness your intervention has for the particular folks that you're working with. Okay. So even more specifically, how can you define social validity for your program? Well, I think there's there's many ways you could probably do this, but here's a couple I'll give you some examples for. One of the things you can really ask yourself is, who are your participants or your consumers? Another way I like to think about it is the consumers of your program, right? Who are these folks? If they're youth and they're adolescents, what are the youth and adolescents? What do they look like? What do they like? What do they like to engage in? And the second thing is thinking about, is your program relevant for them? And how do you know this? Okay, so these little cartoons here on the bottom, really what the take-home message is in these cartoons is you want to be on the same page, like this guy lecturing here, and I've lectured a lot, so I've felt this way many times, but you want to be on the same page as your consumers, as your audience, right? You want to be seeing things in the same way. So as an adult, right, as the interventionist, as the guy who's supposed to know a lot, right? If I'm just coming at this from my perspective and not considering the perspective of the consumers or the folks that I'm going to be working with, Why would I make the assumption that everything I'm going to do, every intervention I'm going to implement is going to make sense for them? That's kind of an assumption I probably shouldn't make. This is another way to kind of think about this, not seeing things in the same way, and again here. But really, two things that I want to leave you with from this slide is thinking about who are your participants and how is it relevant for them. So how do you figure that out? Well, in some of the studies we've done it in different ways, and we've worked both in school-based studies, we've worked in treatment-based studies in the community and so forth. This is an example from one of our treatment-based studies, but could be easily mapped onto a school-based study. This is from one of our papers. And I realize, I'm sorry, once after I got this on here, I realized it's not as clear. This diagram is not as clear, but we're just going to focus on this top box here. In this stage one, it's called stage one, sources of information. And within this box is the basic areas where you typically get information about interventions before you deliver them. So for example, if you're working in a setting and you want to deliver an intervention, you may go to a list and say, well, these are all the evidence-based practices, so I'm just going to choose one off the list. Or, so that would be kind of like going to the literature base and seeing what's out there. You may ask some experts, and believe me, there's no lack of experts out there to give you some opinions of what they think. So you may ask some experts about what they think, what interventions are best, and whatever else. And you may also have some team development within your own setting. So if you work in a school setting or in a research team or in a community treatment setting, you may ask your colleagues and so forth, which things should we implement? Well, by and large, one of the areas that we don't do enough of is this fourth component here, which is engage the community stakeholders. And what I mean by that is we don't ask the participants or the potential participants or the past participants of interventions what they think about them or what they thought about them. What we did in this particular study is we actually did do that. We did a series of focus groups in which we asked community stakeholders, or more specifically related to this webinar, direct and indirect consumers of the intervention. So we asked adolescents, we asked their parents, we asked other treatment providers, so on and so forth. We asked them about the intervention, which is getting into this part, before we delivered it, and to get their ideas about what are the things you like, what are the things you don't like about this substance use intervention. So we've done similar things with school-based interventions as well. But really the goal here is asking our consumers before, or potential consumers, right? The folks that we think are going to engage in intervention before we even get to that point, what do you think about them? Why? Because the reason we do that is because we can learn a lot about the intervention, which can help things like engagement and retention before we even start to implement it. Because if we just choose an intervention because it's the greatest thing on the list, right, and someone else recommended it, and we don't consider those other implementation principles, the things that I talked about along that continuum, then we're putting ourselves in a tough spot, because it's less likely that our intervention is going to be as attractive, right, or it's going to have as much social validity as we think it's going to have, because we're not engaging the consumers before we actually do that. So more specifically, kind of what's an example of us doing that? Here's one. So this is a really practical, specific example. This is from the study that I just showed you. And so one of the things that we learned, and this was out of actually a research-based community study. So what we did actually is we tested a 12-session cognitive behavioral intervention with Latino adolescents. All of our participants were Latino adolescents. And we said, what are the things that you currently like or don't like about substance use interventions? What are the things we could change about that? What are some of the things that would make sense? And one of the things we found by and large is that participants told us, both either direct or indirect consumers, right? So the adolescents themselves or the parents, and we know parents are important, right? Because if you engage parents, you're more likely to engage adolescents, is that it was really hard for them when they got involved in studies like this to understand what was going on. Right? And if you think about the last time you ever engaged in a research-based study or so forth, there's usually this thing we have called a consent form that's usually like 5-6 pages long, really dense, single-spaced. And even though people are supposed to read through that, and we say they do, they hardly do, right? Because it's really long and really hard to understand for the kind of the average consumer of our interventions. So what we did is I had one of the grad students I worked with, based on information and examples that we got from the focus groups we worked with, come up with this model here. And what this was actually, it was a trifold brochure that we made on Microsoft Publisher, so really low tech, low cost. And what we did is we visually kind of placed the different elements of the intervention. So here's an initial, so what can you expect? Here's an initial phone screen, here's an informational session, here's a first meeting, here's what the treatment's gonna look like, here's a second session, third session, fourth meeting. These are all, this is like pre-treatment assessment, post-treatment assessment, and we followed these youth up for 12 months after the intervention ended. and so forth. But what we really did was we increased the social validity of the engagement process because we increased their understanding of what the intervention looked like, what we were asking them to engage in, and what they were asking them to do. So from the initial point, we would have parents or adolescents writing things down on this form, on the sheet, because we would give it to them, and this is something they could tack up on their refrigerator, on their wall, whatever, so that by the time we called them for their fourth meeting, they didn't forget who we are, and so on and so forth. But we just made the process more clearer based on the advice and the examples that we got from the focus groups we worked with. So what we did is we increased the social validity or the attractiveness of the program, because people are more likely to engage in something when they can actually understand what it is that they're engaging in. And that's just kind of one example of what we did. We had a bunch more, but I don't have time to go into it. But that's specifically, I wanted to leave you with one, kind of thinking about social validity. Okay, so how do you enhance the social validity of your program when you're thinking about things from more the macro level? Well, one of the things you can do is like I've just suggested, is we review the literature. You can look at lists, right, or review things that have been done before, right? You don't always necessarily have to make it up, but there's plenty of things in the literature or other places that you can go towards, or the web makes things so accessible now. Just do a review on Google or Google Scholar and think about things that you want to implement, and for example, working with youth, working with Latino youth and school-based interventions, if that's what you're interested in. The other thing is review the demographics for your setting. Who are your consumers? What do they look like? So to give you a plug, in 2 weeks, I'm going to do a webinar that's about using epidemiological data. And I use that a lot in my work. And the reason I use that is because as I can get closer to the actual consumers that I'm going to work with, as I know more about them, it helps me kind of tailor the interventions for them, which naturally increases the opportunity to enhance things like recruitment and retention. So one of the things I do is, do I already have information about the demographics for my setting, instead of making assumptions about what all the youth look like in the particular school? So if I'm going to be working in schools that have a high percentage of Latino youth in examples and experiences that I've done, how am I going to tailor the interventions to make so that it makes sense for the youth I'm going to be working with? I'm going to be working with a specific age group, right? If I'm going to work with 12-year-olds versus 18-year-olds, how's that going to make a difference? And so on and so forth. So what I'm really trying to get you to do is, as much as possible, understand the demographics for the setting you're going to work with, and don't assume that just because you pick the intervention off the list that it's going to make sense for the folks that are in your setting. The other thing is, ask others who have done this before. So just like you're kind of doing today as we do this webinar, getting advice from me and other people and so forth, or your other colleagues and others who have had good success at implementing interventions with different groups, right? What does that look like? What are the things you've tried? And a lot of times when I talk about these types of interventions and implementation strategies, and I go into the research and go into the statistics of what our outcomes showed, people usually come bored by the statistics, and they're more interested in the stories in terms of, well, how did you do that? How did you overcome this challenge? How did you actually get youth to return their practice sheets, right? Because we know that's one thing that's difficult, that could be difficult in interventions. How did you actually get youth to attend the sessions and so on and so forth? So asking others who have done this before, and I've given you some ideas today, but asking others who have done this before is really a kind of a key thing to expanding your network. And it's specifically, if you can do that within the context for the demographics, for the individuals who are more likely, who are going to be more like the ones you're going to work with, right? And in the settings that you're going to work in. And the other thing that I really encourage you to do is ask either your potential, your current, or your past consumers of programs. So if you've implemented programs before, and either they've gone spectacularly well or they failed miserably, both ends of that they're really good places to get good sources of data. Because even if your interventions have failed, and meaning you've had a hard time recruiting and retaining, that's okay, because those are things you can learn from. Right? And those are ways you can ask your past participants and say, your adolescents and your youth, and say, what are things you liked about the program? What are things you didn't like about the program? At the end of like I said, one of the things that we do at the beginning of our interventions is, by the time they walk out, from the first session, I want them to know what the benefit is to them. At the last session, one of the things we always do with our youth is ask them, what are the things, we kind of do an evaluation with them and ask them, what are the things they like about the program, what are the things they don't like about the program? And we do that in part because we use that information to enhance our programs for future interventions. And we tell the youth that we do that. And you'd be surprised if you haven't done this before, you'd be surprised how engaged youth get when you're actually asking them their advice, right? And asking them about their experiences and telling them that you're actually going to use that information to help inform the practices and the things that you do, but also use that to inform the future youth who go through your program. That's pretty powerful stuff. And this is a good source of information, one that we typically overlook, but asking folks who are close to you in your setting is really great. We also do this with assessments that we use and so forth. For example, just really quickly, if a particular assessment hasn't been used with youth, but it's more of an adult assessment, we'll ask some youth to take it and see what they think. Are there questions that don't make sense, and so on and so forth. It's so much better to find those things out, to understand those potential barriers before you go on full-scale implementation of a program, as opposed to after. Okay, so what are so more specifically, what are some steps to increase, so I talked about ways to increase social validity, so what are some steps to increase engagement and retention in your intervention? And these are kind of some summary steps, some things that we talked about. One is a way to define engagement and retention for your program. So I talked about in the first few slides, really thinking about, for your intervention program, how do you define engagement and retention? What does that look like, right? Is engagement for you the number of practice sheets they return, the number of times they raise their hand, the number of questions that they ask, the number of answers that they provide, the number of times that they talk with others in the group, whatever that is. But the main thing is that it's meaningful for your intervention, and that it's meaningful in the sense that it's actually an outcome that you want to track, and it helps you know something about your intervention. And what we tend to find is that for youth that are more engaged in interventions, they tend to do better in the intervention. And they also tend to be retained longer in the intervention, which brings us to the next point in terms of the retention. What is it about retention? What do you want to know? Is retention for you, is it the number of times they attend the session? Is it something else relevant to that? Many times it's related to attendance and so forth. But again, the key component here is however you define that for your program, it needs to be meaningful for your program. Okay, and because it needs to be an outcome that makes sense for you. Second step that I like to point out is review past engagement and retention data for your program. So like I talked about in a previous slide, so even if your program has failed miserably or it's gone exceedingly well, think about the reasons for that, but also think about what your engagement and retention data look like. So, in the behavioral world, behavioral literature, we talk about 80% marks. So if we're at an 80%, if youth are attending 80%, that's probably pretty darn good. But if your past engagement and retention data for the programs you're implementing are already at 80% or above, are those really things you really need to be working on? Maybe you want to work on something else. However, as I showed you with the treatment data that I presented nationally in the first few slides, if retention data is less than 50%, right? So if less than 50% are actually of the youth in your interventions are actually completing it, is that something you want to work on? Chances are probably yeah. So if you think about the less than 50%, what I talked about before, that's less than chance. So what I talked about from the treatment data, if you think about it in another way, when 60% of kids are not completing treatment, if a youth is likely to walk into my treatment center, on average, and if I was a betting person, which I tend not to be, but if I was a betting person, I would bet that the youth is less likely to complete my intervention than more likely, right? Which is not something that I necessarily want. So one of the ways I can get at that is think, well, what are my past engagement and retention rates? And then what are the things that I can do to improve them, which goes along to our third point here, which I talked about reviewing both the micro and macro levels of the program. And a lot of times I think we get stuck on, myself included, more the micro levels. So what are the things we can do to change this particular behavior, and don't focus as much on what are the macro levels. Who are our indirect consumers of this intervention? What are things that we can do to implement or increase the social attractiveness intervention so it becomes attractive on a broader level and that people actually want to engage in it. So not only becomes attractive to the adolescents we work with, but also becomes more attractive to their parents and so forth, or to the school that we're working in. If you work in school-based settings, one of the things that the other faculty in the school can help make or break your intervention, right? So how do we get other teachers on board with the intervention? That's what I mean by indirect consumers as as well, and thinking about what is it the benefit to them, right? And the social attractiveness to them in terms of delivering our intervention within a school setting. And I could go on and on about that because we've done a lot of that, and but that's not, we don't have time, unfortunately, today. The other thing, step 4, is also after you've defined it in step 1 and then reviewed your past data and then also reviewed kind of what changes you're going to make, collect data on engagement retention. I can't tell you how many times when I've done lectures or presentations and so forth, and I'll ask folks working in different settings, I go, what are your retention and engagement rates? And they don't know, in part because they likely already have the data somewhere, but maybe they haven't looked at it. And so what I really encourage you to do is look at what is your engagement and retention rates, specifically, before, but also after you made some of your changes to your interventions, that hopefully you want to see those engagement and retention rates increase, not continue to decrease. And if that's the case, if they continue to decrease, then you know that something you did in step 3 is maybe not working, so that's something you need to go and modify, which kind of helps us with step 5, or goes to step 5, which is revise as needed, right? We don't always know the right answers from the very beginning, and it may be a work in progress. It may be things that we need to come to or understand after we've collected some data, after we've seen some things not work or work, right? And think about how we need to revise those things slightly, or maybe make a bigger revision in terms of ways to increase recruitment and retention. Okay, the other thing that I want to leave you with, in part, because we're getting to our last couple slides here, and I do want to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions, is I get asked a lot, so what program should I implement? So, and here's what I suggest. Rather than asking yourself, what program should I implement? Think about it more specifically, is what is the problem to be addressed, okay? In your particular setting, are you going to address substance use? Are you going to address acting out behavior? Are you going to address bullying behavior? Are you going to address a combination of those things? Because we know that behaviors tend to coalesce together, right? They don't occur in a vacuum. So one of the things is what problems or concerns or issues need to be addressed, because that's going to guide you towards what interventions do you want to look at. Because if your intervention doesn't address the problems or the concerns that you have in your setting, it's probably not the intervention for you. The second thing is the setting ready to implement an intervention, right? If you're working in a school setting, how do you get the school on board? There's tons of literature on this in terms of how do you get a school on board, how do you get personnel on board, how do you get folks on board to deliver intervention, and a lot of legwork you can do before you ever implement the intervention. So an intervention, the best way to intervention is generally not based on what is the shiniest binder, what does the best curriculum look like per se. It's probably what's going to address my problem. Is the setting that I'm working in ready to implement an intervention? Which leads us to the next thing. What are the gaps in the existing programming that you have? So if we go back to our triangle, right? If you already have a universal-based intervention in your setting, such as a school, then maybe you don't need to duplicate that, right? Maybe really what you need is a secondary level or a tertiary level intervention in your school to hit kind of all levels of prevention, so to speak. So one of the things I also encourage you to do is find out what the gaps are in your existing program, which goes back into what problem are we going to address, and is your setting ready to implement intervention? Because I'd rather have you not waste your time on duplicating interventions, but actually have you implement something that your setting actually needs and can benefit from. And then the fourth thing is, what is the plan for sustainability? And this is a constant issue, especially with grant funding, and I realize this because I've worked on a lot of grants. Does the plan for sustainability just last as long as the grant does? Is it over after that? What does that look like? And as I've done this more, I would really encourage you to think about from the very beginning, if this is an intervention that makes sense and has good outcomes and so forth, what are the things that we're going to try to build in to sustain them across time? What does that look like? Okay, and the last slide that I'm going to leave you with, because we're getting to time here, is again related to the prior slide I just showed you, because I get asked a lot, well, what program should I implement? And again, instead of asking what program should I implement, I would ask yourself the 4 questions on the prior slide. But in addition to that, because 2 weeks ago I did a webinar talking about adolescent development in terms of the biological and social development, and how those things map on to the interventions we do. And in this particular, the one I'm doing today is not focused on that, but I want to leave you with this slide, because the other thing I want you to consider is, depending on what age range you're working with, there's different developmental tasks that adolescents are working on, right? So identity tends to be a common thing among all of them, but if you think about it biologically, you know, we can talk about brain development, we can talk about whatever you want, but risk-taking, impulsivity, emotional regulation, as we're adolescents tend to get a little bit older, they're going to be more focused on individuation, connection, exploration, and then school to work as they get a little bit older. But what I'm trying to point out, and these lists are not exhaustive, there's other things that could be on here as well. These tend to be more frequent things that I come across, but they're also related to intervention areas. So developmentally, if your adolescent's working on specific things, right, probably intervention areas that you want to be working on is emotional regulation, right? How do we regulate emotions like depression and anger? Problem solving, decision making, peer relations. And problem solving as we go across age groups is not something that tends to go away, but the focus of it slightly changes in terms of what problems, what decisions they're trying to make, and so forth. So I like this slide in part because I think it helps inform the other one, and it kind of also gets you to think about, if I'm going to implement an intervention, right, and it's an intervention, am I just going to take it from a list and not think about, you know, what it makes sense for the consumer and so forth? Well, I actually suggest you do think about how the consumer is involved and think about the more broad macro levels. In addition to asking yourself the 4 questions on the prior slide, in addition to thinking about, well, what are the developmental tasks of the adolescents that I'm going to be working with, and does the intervention help to address some of those things? And the reality is that many of the interventions that you're going to find on your list do address many of these things, and those is in part the reason why. It's because they are developmental tasks, either social or biological, that adolescents work with across time, or things they're working on. Okay, so I also want to give a plug for our next webinar, which is also along the broader context of informing prevention. And next time I'm going to be talking about using the use of effective epidemiological data. So where do you gather data from? So I talked about, you know, gathering demographic data or other types of data. What does that look like? Where can I access this stuff, both at a national, more local level? And why does that make sense for doing it? You know, what is important for me for doing that? So I want to thank you, but I also want to take some time for questions. We roughly have about 9 minutes left or so. So I just want to, if I have some time, try to answer some questions if possible.
Jason, Laura asked, what was reviewed in each of the subsequent meetings? And I'm not sure what she's referring to. So Laura, if you're still on, feel free to elaborate a little bit in the chat feature.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure. So I'm not sure exactly what Laura's referring to, so.
Okay, we can get back to her. And the next question is, as far as retention and successful completion goes, is there anything to be said about giving teens the power to choose their own programming and treatment and which modalities they want to participate in, such as individual or family therapy groups, etc.? In other words, are teens more likely to succeed if they choose their services, even if they may select a less intensive intervention than what may have been recommended?
Yeah, that is a great question. Thanks for asking it. And yes, that's kind of what I'm getting at. Although the specific question is focused on, you know, can they choose the specific intervention? And I'm not going to go into that a lot because most of the time we don't have that much accessibility for teens, right? We don't have like 5 interventions that they can choose from. We typically have maybe 1 or 2 or 1 at the most. And what I'm saying is, what if we do just have 1 intervention? How do we get them to engage in the process? But part of that question is just what you're saying, asking them from the beginning, what are the things that are relevant for the teens with the intervention that we're trying to offer? And you can do some of that legwork up front from the very beginning. And that's why I'm saying really trying to understand the teens that you're working with, because although you can't know everything about every teen there is, you actually can know about the teens that you work with in particular settings. So what I say when you're working, for example, in school-based settings, you can't know about everybody about every school that there is, but you probably have a pretty good idea of the youth that you work with within your particular school setting.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Let's see, the next question says, this is from Dana. Can you touch on treatment and correction settings for juveniles?
Yeah, so treatment and correction settings it depends on where it's offered, right? If it's offered in the correction setting, so actually This studies that I was referring you to, or I showed you, I've done both school-based and community-based. The studies that I referred you to, though, in my slides, are actually youth that are all referred out of juvenile justice. But we did it in a community-based setting because those youth were not receiving treatment. They're all community or juvenile justice-based referrals, but they were allowed to receive treatment outpatient, which outpatient treatment, by and large, is the most popular treatment that youth are likely to get. So without going into a lot of detail, which I could, but it really depends on the settings that they're in. But I have to say, I've done a lot of work in juvenile justice, and it's the same concepts. And I've given the same type of talk to juvenile justice folks, is that you really have to think about the consumers you're working with and how that intervention fits them. So as opposed to thinking about what's just the best intervention on the list and why should, it should absolutely work, that doesn't always make sense, because you can tell that in your retention outcomes, that it doesn't always. Because kids, even if they're, quote, forced to be there, right, it doesn't always mean they're going to engage.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So this is from Gloria.
Yeah.
Aren't evidence-based programs already supposed to test them with the intended demographic? Also, yeah. What is the best way to involve school personnel in interventions given their classroom commitments?
That's a great question. And no, programs, the problem is, Gloria, and I've done a lot of work in this area, is that when you go to the list for evidence-based programs, it doesn't mean they've tested them with all intended demographics. It means they've tested them with the demographics that the studies are based on. So you really have to go back to the studies and look at it. One of the criticisms in the literature around evidence-based programs is that they may not have been tested with specific ethnic and racial minority groups. So for example, that's one of the reasons that I did the study that I did, was testing what does CBT look like for Latino youth? And are there things that we need to adapt and so forth? Because you can't make the assumption, and it's such a great question, but you can't make the assumption that just because it's an evidence-based program that it works for everyone. That's the assumption that typically gets made, but it's not accurate. And the other thing is the best way to involve school personnel in interventions given their classroom commitments, it depends. If you have an interventionist coming into a classroom and doing the intervention, which we've done some of, if it's a classroom-based intervention, it just depends on how the intervention's worked out. What I've tended to find is that you have to start with a champion in the school. Many times it's been like our school counselor and so forth, or maybe a teacher and so forth. But those are some of the larger macro level issues that you kind of have to overcome as you implement the program. And I think the best programs are those that become part of the fabric of the school that they're in. And I could go on and on about how to do that, but that's just kind of my real quick answer here, just because on time.
Jason, a question from Carolyn. Do you believe that the low youth completion rates are due to program developers not taking into account the macro influence?
Yeah, personally, I think it's probably a number of things, but yes, I think that's one of the reasons why. I think naturally what we tend to assume is that this intervention's greatest thing since sliced bread, greatest thing since the pocket on my shirt, right? So I'm just going to use it for everybody and it's going to work well. And I think those assumptions don't always work out. So yeah, I do think. And that's what our research has shown. When we do start to take some of those things into account, that recruitment and retention is not one of our major obstacles anymore.
It looks like that is all of our questions at this time.
Thank you. Great questions.
Okay, so here is a QR code for those of you who have a QR scanner and want to scan this to receive the link to the survey. It is also posted in the chat box for those of you who just want to click on the link. We really appreciate you taking the time to complete the survey.
It looks like one person asked, is there a link to the PowerPoint? I think we will put them up, the PowerPoint as a PDF, so.
Yes, those will be listed on our website along with the recording of the webinar.
Okay, if there's, I don't know if there's, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for spending some time with us this either morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. And I really appreciate it. So hopefully it was useful to you, and feel free to reach out. You have my email if you have other questions. And also, feel free to attend some of our other webinars.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.